Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about ethical implications of advanced analytics in healthcare. So let's start on the data privacy and security side, kind of the more regulatory piece, the blocking and tackling. We have to protect the sensitive information that we have been entrusted with. So that means having good consent about how we use the data. Data breaches are handled appropriately. We anonymize the data wherever possible. This is just a few topics, but we'll discuss much broader than that. But in protecting sensitive health data, it's an important topic because we've got this highly personal data that can have consequences for folks if it's released. And so we want to maintain as much integrity and confidentiality of our use of that data where possible. So that can be exposed through cyber attacks. You've probably heard the terms phishing or ransomware, which are just two different ways of trying to get access to data. There are also insider threats. So folks inside the institution operating, not in the common interest of the patient's data. That can be small things or big things. Folks that have infiltrated an institution just for the purpose of accessing data and selling it. It could be people that get into an institution and are just curious and just start exploring a little bit on their own without permission. Those sorts of things happen usually through weak access controls, which is both an insider threat and outsider threat. Weak access controls. So some of those best practices that we use in this are encrypting the data, having good role-based access controls so that an analyst has appropriate access to data that is different from a manager, that is different from an IT professional, depending on what they need to do. And everyone's been trained to their level of access so they understand it and don't have more than they need. There's also ethical issues with patient consent, giving permission to use data. So the term for consent is informed, or the term here is informed consent. Does the patient have a knowledge of how we will be using their data? That is usually talked about as, do we have ongoing consent or a one-time based consent? And there's a bit of a dilemma there. So informed consent is just that the patient understands. The best case scenario here is that we have been clear, concise, and transparent with our consent. I think the historical model of this is bury it in a legal document, make them sign it when they're rushed and aren't going to look at it anyway. And then we're good to go. We've got the legal basis to go ahead and use their data. And there's still institutions that operate that way, but better practice is to figure out how can we put the decision in front of patients. And we want patients to feel involved in this decision. And one of the best ways to do that is to have it be dynamic or ongoing instead of one-time consent at the beginning of their care. Lord knows when they're 18, keeping that until they're 65. But instead, how do we regularly inform people of how we intend to use their data to improve care and letting them be a part of that decision? So there's this balancing act here. We want to improve medical care. We want to use as much data as possible to do that. In fact, we want to use all the data that we possibly can, but we want to be good stewards and partners of this information with those that own it, the patient. So there's this balancing act. You're going to hear this come up over and over again in a lot of my other items that we talk about here is this balancing act. And so there's not a lot of absolutes here on the ethical side. There's a lot of best practices and people trying to do better at giving people choices, but also wanting to be able to continue to improve care and innovate. So that's just a part of this. Okay, so data breaches are another major issue because they're possible. It's usually possible technically for data to be released inadvertently or on purpose that shouldn't be. And so healthcare data breaches can be big because we keep and store so much information about patients that's highly personal. So the consequences you can already probably intuit, right? It is that the individuals that have this release could have identity theft, financial fraud, but also on the healthcare side, there's major risk of institutional reputation. That's a really major and real risk for an institution that has a breach and doesn't handle it well. Causes we've already mentioned, ransomware and phishing. Ransomware is one of those things that is planned for by all major institutions as a when this happens, here's how we will react, not even as a if this happens. Phishing is planned for by thoughtful institutions by doing proactive screenings, sending out fake emails to try to catch people and keep their employees informed about what the most current versions of this look like. Phishing is where they've engineered a message or some way that you inadvertently enter your credentials somewhere that you shouldn't so that they have access to them. And it can also happen through negligence. That's probably one of the bigger risks that we have, and so we have to figure out how do we safeguard against that. When there is a data breach, there certainly has to be an instant response. You have to respond to the issue that happened, make sure that it gets stopped and isolated as quickly as possible, and that we figure out the reason. However, that's where the forensics comes in. The main way that this should be worked on day to day, in and out, the way that this should be handled is actually through proactive measures like regular staff training, and updating and having good security policies and procedures to find issues and fix them whenever identified. In fact, a lot of institutions have teams that are regularly testing and working to break the system, to break in and find vulnerabilities so that they can be fixed, which is a pretty fun and interesting job. If you ever wanted to head down a little bit more technical route, that's a really cool one. Anonymizing data. So data anonymization is the techniques of taking highly personal data that's informs a lot about someone and trying to obscure or mask it so that people can't tell who the data is about. The risk, however, is that you have to apply a process to do this, right? An algorithm or some way of switching and changing the data. So someone can re-engineer that, figure out how you did it, especially if you've done it somewhat simply. So re-identification is a real possibility, and it's a risk that you try to lessen by having more advanced and useful anonymization techniques. But guess what? There's a balancing act with this too. The balancing act is being overly strict or really advanced in your anonymization could obscure, change the value in the data. So you may have data that really informs well on length of stay, but you've decided that's a really that the admission date and discharge date are something that could be used for an outside person to identify who this record is about. And so you're like, well, let's move those around. Let's put it forward a few days, backward a few days, might be a decision you think about. However, now you've taken away arrival patterns. You don't have an accurate arrival pattern. Discharge patterns, you don't have accurately represented in your data anymore. Now, there's ways to think about that, doing that and trying to keep that value, but this is the balancing act of, hey, we want to do anonymization. Hold on. Now we've got data that doesn't represent reality anymore. It's not useful. It's not going to give us what we need in prediction. So, major concern. Okay, regulatory frameworks. HIPAA and GDPR. HIPAA is the U.S. regulatory framework that dictates what needs to be done to protect protected health information, PHI. Enforced through civil and criminal penalties. It is the rules and regulations around how you keep, store, and safeguard data. And the GDPR is a little bit broader. It has more to do with their broader individual liberties around personal data and its use, protects their rights there, emphasizes consent, data minimization, taking as little as possible or keeping as little as possible, and the right to be forgotten. So you can't have my data forever, which is probably a good idea, and data portability, not being able to just share data at will. So there are also enforcement mechanisms for GDPR. This only applies to patients who are from the European Union. And so if you service patients like that, you have to have a different understanding of a totally different regulatory framework and incorporate it properly with HIPAA as well. One trend that is increasing is the local governments coming up with their own version. So looking for individual states. I think in the future this will continue to grow as individual states decide how they would like to regulate and operate separate from the federal government. So keep an eye out for this in your local area or anywhere that you serve patients for regulations that crop up from more local governments and folks. So the conclusion here, it's really important in this environment to take a proactive stance. The considerations are to figure out how do we keep data security integrated throughout everything that we do all the way through so that we're protecting every step along the way. If you've ever been a part of an institution you would consider as having a really great culture, you would know exactly what I mean here. There's this term, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think there's probably a version that works here too, like culture eats policy for breakfast, right? So a culture of we really care about making sure data is secure and we inform our patients well about how we're using their data. That sort of culture, if it permeates your institution, is going to beat strict policies and procedures every time. So this is the goal, but often, elusive and difficult to really accomplish. So the kind of cornerstones, though, would be ongoing education about everything that you're doing to protect patients. And again, we have a balance here. This is the difficult thing, is that locking down everything can stifle innovation and integrity. We want to work to figure out what is the win-win. Where can we both increase consent, increase security, and put data in innovators' hands so that we can encourage data-driven healthcare decisions and more advanced solutions for solving problems. So this is the balance that just continually shows up in this environment. There are many resources. If you ever thought this would be a part of your future, if you're interested in this sort of work, the data governance type field, there are certifications you can seek. I don't personally have one, and I haven't seen many folks with them, but it may be a great fit if you're interested in either going into this environment of data, the data privacy and security framework, data privacy and security area, or if you are just interested in having a little feather in your cap. So if you're just wanting something on your resume that says, hey, I understand this environment, I would look for some HIPAA compliance training. There are reputable programs online that you can take to get, small online-based modules to ensure that you understand the basics of that ruling. And it might be just a nice little feather in your cap on your resume to say, I've dedicated a little time to understand this environment. If you are already in healthcare or headed into healthcare, you've probably already hit this and you are going to have this covered by your institution. So it's not like you have to proactively go out and do this for yourself. Institutions are really keen on making sure their employees are educated well on this. Okay, let's talk about it. This is the one that gets people kind of puckering up a little bit. Bias and fairness in analytics. Now, stick with me. I know this can be a sensitive topic, but I think you're going to see that sticking to the basic fundamental value that we're trying to drive here is really what matters. Sticking to the fact that we are trying to solve problems or inform on problems in healthcare for everybody that we care for is the key concern. And so sometimes that is over some kind of sensitive topics, issues like gender, race, socioeconomic status, geography. But the truth is fundamental here, that we are trying to make sure that we are performing well on the solution we've built for everybody that we care for. And that it should be the case across everything, sensitive or not. So in overview, if you haven't heard this concept brought up before, machine learning and AI models have a potential to propagate or bring forward bias from how the data was trained. So bias in data is when discriminatory patterns based on those things get brought forward into the solution. Algorithmic bias is when the modeling itself learns from something in the past that was non-representative or skewed in such a way that ends up giving an unequal performance out the other end. So there are solutions in this area. A couple of them I'll mention here, we'll mention others later, are bias detection. So there's ways, techniques for just seeing if we've done well for everybody. And that's basic performance evaluation. Doing performance evaluation across all of the variables that we care about. And of course we care about doing this well across genders, across race, and across socioeconomic status. So this is just putting in and being thoughtful about, are we performing well across those areas and all areas? Do we have good monitoring in place to evaluate our performance over the dimensions that we care about? Is a fundamental basic that should be in place anyway, but it's a great opportunity to pause and make sure that we're doing so because we're serving people. We want to make sure that we're serving people well. Inclusive data collection is another upfront, more proactive stance to take and ensuring that we've got good representation in our data of all the populations that we serve and as many as we can gather so that populations we serve in the future can have good accuracy of our solution. The two different sources of bias are talked about as skewed demographics. So underrepresentation of one of those groups that we just talked about. So you can imagine if the historical data does not have many people of a certain race, it can't train well. It can't get good knowledge of how to perform on those patients for whatever our solution is. Historical inequalities in healthcare systems, if they have historically underserviced particular populations, whatever pattern you've seen in history will be brought forward. All we're doing when we're predicting is looking at as much history as possible to figure out what the future is going to look like. So if there's something in the history you don't like and don't want to continue forward, that is actually a major issue in your how you train. You're going to have to figure out how to train differently. And in fact, this goes far beyond just this issue. This comes up very often, generically in problem solving. We do want to predict, but we don't want to just continue doing what we've always done. So we'll probably talk about that in later courses. Impact models trained on bias data end up bringing that data forward. So it can build on and exacerbate those disparities rather than improve them. So the discriminatory patterns can be across many factors that we've already sort of talked about, but there's also an opportunity that we could have data quality as a concern in our data. Missing or inaccurate data can also skew our models in a similar way. So inconsistent coding, processes, anything that collects the data and doesn't give us clean, precise data means we won't have clean, precise solutions. So there's real world consequences to these things, like biased health risk scores and the like. Any algorithm basically can be influenced by not having enough good data to train on about everybody. Okay, so we talk about what might be done here. Model design and feature selection. Choosing features that correlate with sensitive attributes can be something that could crop up as an issue. So that is interesting, but also what it does is it can end up kind of hiding the bias or issue that you're having in your performance. So as an example, you can think of, you could grab a feature that you did not realize correlates with socioeconomic status. So you may grab a feature like zip code, where they live, and not realize that zip code also describes neighborhoods, which would sort of point to their socioeconomic status. And by doing so, you might not realize that you're actually segmenting groups into their different statuses. And if you're segmenting them and treating them different, that may be an unintended output or outcome from solving a problem in this way and using zip code that you really didn't want to do. So you can end up having this issue come through to your solution, which you really want to avoid. Bias predictions models can systematically favor one group over another. let's say in a diagnosis or treatment recommendation. This can happen even if you do have good representative data, just because the algorithm is continuing to search for anything it can find to improve performance. And so if it can do so by performing really well on individual groups, but they may start to lack on others, the algorithm does not care as long as the overall performance gets better. So this is one that's a little more difficult to assess and understand, but an algorithm just is trying to optimize to whatever you tell it to optimize to. So if you tell it to optimize to the overall accuracy, and because of how your data is looks, it is going to do best at that task by performing really well on the main group and leaving out a bunch of other folks, it's going to do that every time, all the time. So there's techniques to address that sort of thing. And it can definitely happen in underrepresented group because we don't have good history to train on. But there are solutions in this. I've kind of painted it as, oh my gosh, there's all these problems. Watch out, watch out, watch out. There's all sorts of things. So monitoring, right? There's fairness metrics used, generally just performance metrics, statistics used to look at how are we doing across all of these categories, especially those that we're really sensitive to. We want to make sure each subgroup is getting good performance with our solution. But there's also more technical techniques, which are interesting. Some of them are kind of common sense, rebalancing the data set. So if we have a underrepresented group that doesn't have a ton of patients or a very small proportion, you can upsample that or recreate extra data or change the proportion by sampling less of the other groups in order to even out who's represented in the data and how the performance does. This should always be done against performance because these things might, if we just do it right up front to say, oh no, we don't want to bias, we better rebalance the data set to make sure we've represented everybody clearly. If you don't check that against performance, there's an opportunity that you might have performed better for all of your groups, including those underrepresented groups, by not rebalancing. So this isn't a, I don't want to bias, we better rebalance. It is a, I want to do as good as I possibly can for everybody. So let's see if rebalancing helps us do better on those individual groups. Let's see if not using it changes the profile of our performance. Post-processing methods to adjust model output are an option as well that I have less experience in, but that is techniques for taking the output and adjusting it to make sure it represents our different groups like we would want it to. So kind of forcing the algorithm's handle a bit. Continuous monitoring is a best practice that we want to put the systems in place to evaluate our performance regularly as often as possible so that we look out for performance starting to degrade or starting to treat different groups in the data differently, especially if we're continuing to train the data. We need to watch out for how it's performing and having as robust of a view of that as possible. Okay, inclusive data collection is another opportunity we have in potential solutions. So that is our proactive stance towards this, that, hey, let's make sure we're getting good data on everybody that we serve so that we can do well in predicting things about all those things. So you might think of issues that could crop up here that are less prevalent today, but initially as smart devices got started and patient portals were being used, we did not get everybody signed up for it. You know, there was a trend of more affluent folks signing up for that online portal and getting all set up in there where we can collect more data. So there's an example where we may gather extra data about a different socioeconomic class inadvertently, just because we're offering a new way to access and enter data. So we might have to think about, well, how do we get everybody involved in this online portal so that we get the data? So that's the type of thing that crops up in the, hold on, do we have good representation in our data and why might we not? Standardized data protocols, so consistent definitions and coding are something that can help here. And then there can be policy and ethical oversight put in place. One of the places you see this at Research institutions is the Institutional Review Board. IRBs are a place where they evaluate really deeply how studies and research is being done. One of those things can be an ethical committee ensuring thoughtful use of data there. So, conclusions, key takeaways. Bias in healthcare is complex and multifaceted. It requires both technical and ethical diligence, but solutions do exist, ranging from model tuning, better data collection, but they do require effort and it's ongoing. There are proactive strategies, and those are always going to be the best to reduce our risk of doing this in healthcare. So that is our equity and bias in advanced analytics in healthcare. Let's talk next about something I really care about, which is transparency and accountability. So this is ensuring that algorithms are used in a way that are understandable, transparent, and accountable. Explainable is the last word here in the overview, and that's a really key one. So why is this an ethical issue? As we continue to find more advanced ways to predict, some of those advanced ways come with the trade-off that how they made their decision is not discoverable. And so one class of algorithms that is well known for this issue is neural networks and deep learning. They tend, from the past, but this is changing as we go forward, to lack interpretability of how they are making their decision and how they're using data to do it explicitly. You can explain how the algorithm is operating overall, but often these are growing to be such big networks that it's difficult to say anything specific about how it's using the input data to come to its conclusion. So that doesn't give very good accountability about how the decision is being made. So when they make errors, how do we trace it back? Who is responsible? What data did we need to do differently? How do we need to change the algorithm to handle different pieces of information better? This is a major issue that I hit all of the time in my work. So healthcare providers are a group that tend to be extraordinarily worried about making good decisions based on evidence, and they want to understand that evidence. Think about a black box solution that just tells them, here's a prediction, and it's quite accurate. Here's our accuracy measurements on it. But you can't tell them what data was it using, how did it use that data, or the like. They're not going to like that solution because they can't get a kind of like interpretable readout of, all right, it incorporated the patient's previous encounters, it incorporated the diagnosis, the working diagnosis, and some of the vital signs, and it used them in this way. That is what they're really looking for. And so we have many times had to make the trade-off for more advanced solutions that have a potential for better accuracy need to be swapped out for analytic solutions that will come with interpretability that can give us a little bit of explanation of what's going on, how it's using data. And it's just a reality of getting buy-in and folks that feel comfortable with the information that they're going to use to care for patients, which makes a ton of sense. There are solutions cropping up in what is called explainable AI, XAI. So there are models being built to understand the models in these more advanced techniques. So it's an area that I don't have as much experience in, but I would say it is absolutely worth keeping your eye on or diving in and researching a little bit if you find that interesting. This is a place where you can jump to the front line right away, or the cutting edge. Sorry, you can jump to the cutting edge of what's going on in advanced analytics by becoming an expert in explainable AI. I don't meet many folks that know it well, and it has a potential to plug a major gap that's in the architecture right now. The last item is also maybe the primary solution that I see today. And in fact, it's the only solution I've ever been a part of, is that there is human in the loop systems. Healthcare is not eager to take predictions and just implement decisions. They always want a human in the loop that is assessing if that information is um, useful and really giving them foresight for their decision and ensuring that there's a human making a good critical thinking choice about how to treat patients. So this is a good way to help alleviate that concern about making decisions just with algorithms, is to make sure they understand we're trying to build the algorithm to give more information for the decision. We're trying to build the algorithm to augment the human's choice. And so wherever you can highlight that as the architecture and design of your solution from the beginning, you're going to do better overall for presenting that solution. Patient consent and data control. So patients have this right to control over their data and how it's used. It helps them protect their autonomy and builds trust. That's an understated value of patient consent. Sometimes it's seen as a barrier or something that's a lot of extra effort, but it absolutely pays dividends in building trust between the healthcare providers or institutions and the patients that they're using the data of. Also helps ensure any ethical standards you want to enforce, as well as regulatory, are being handled proactively. So the definition of informed consent is patient has clear understanding of what data is collected and how it's going to be used. So this is the best case scenario, and there are barriers to it. There's difficulty in explaining clearly how complex machine learning or these complex algorithms will be used to turn through data. And so ensuring meaningful consent is a bit of an art of how do we let patients know enough but not confuse them about what their data is going to be used for. And so this is one of those balancing acts I've already mentioned, continues to crop up, this balance between how do we explain it without confusing or taking a ton of time from people that they don't want to give. There's some best practices here. Clear and transparent is the guiding principle. Is the communication for consent understandable, and does it share everything that we need to be transparent? Ongoing communication is an underrated way to handle this. Continuing to engage patients in this decision is a way to have them think about it a little more deeply and reassess their decisions as they go. There's also solutions cropping up here. You can imagine there's digital tools to track and manage consent a little more dynamically to accomplish some of these best practices. So there are solutions out there. You can think of consent as either opt-in or opt-out. The opt-out tended to be how we operated in the past. Patients are included automatically. They've already signed something. We've got access to them, so we can use their data. It's very practical, very practical from a large-scale institution. So I'm talking about it in a sort of negative tone, but the truth is, at scale, this is really hard to accomplish properly. And so doing the opt-out can make a lot of sense. Trying to be efficient. But there's risk, ethical concerns about do patients really understand how we're using their data and what we're using. So opt-in is another direction to consider as patients actively choose to allow the use of their data. So it's considered a higher ethical standard and ensures that we've got explicit agreement from patients. It doesn't ensure it completely, because you could still make an opt-in process that's confusing and long and often skipped, so that they're really saying yes but not getting informed and being a good decision maker in that. But it's all taking steps to get better, not being perfect. Ethical considerations: how clear is data use communication? And this balance is between, we want to continue to build the benefit that we can from data and accomplish better care, but at the same time, we want to see people feel more in control of their data and understanding how we are using it. So guess what? Another balancing act, like I've been saying, just keeps coming up back again and again and again. So let's look at a simple kind of example. We've got large scale genomic data. We've got genetic data about patients in a research database. The opt-in approach would result in far lower enrollment. So we just don't get the data that we could because we've asked people ahead of time, hey, we've collected or we have your genomic data because of this database, or it's available through 23andMe or whatever. Can we go ahead and borrow that data and use it for your health decisions? And so some portion of the people are going to say, no, no, thank you. I would rather not my entire genetic sequence. And so we're going to probably have less information to use for our decision making and our algorithms. But the alternative is opt out, where we're going to get a ton more data, but if someone finds out, through the grapevine, through a backdoor, through the news, through just thoughtful consideration, that the health institution has been using their genetic data just because they had a legal, leg to stand on to do so, and they never asked, that could really violate trust of the patient. And so those are the kind of choices that you have to make in how are we going to get buy-in from patients. So a couple lessons learned on that. Effective communication and transparency really improves patient acceptance. So it's not an either or. It is a how can we do as good as possible. So in the opt-in scenario, yes, we may get lower enrollment, but how can we mitigate that? Through effective communication, transparency, and trying to improve that patient acceptance rate. The other opportunity to even push it further and be doing even better is looking at dynamic consent. So let's do opt-in that continues to inform the patient about new potential uses of their data and give that decision back to them as they continue to engage with the choice. So dynamic consent frameworks are that best practice. They're typically managed through technology-driven platforms that enable patients to take control over the use of their data and to adjust it over time. In these, we try to accomplish the transparent communication piece with clear, accessible explanations of how the data will be used and the benefits that it can build for patients. Patient-centric policies are another desire. That's where we would like to be, is that we are getting regular patient feedback and improving this to be centered around the patient and accomplishing as much as we can, keeping them informed. So this is one of these topics that is actually quite helpful and useful to discuss. Maybe we'll be in class together someday and we'll be able to discuss things like this. In lieu of that, I just present these couple of questions as things to mull on a little bit. Should healthcare organizations prioritize opt-in or autonomy, or should they be prioritizing the broader societal or social benefit? They have access to a ton of data and they have a legal grounds to use it. So why shouldn't they get busy and start building solutions? They're only trying to help, right? This is one of those really tough questions. I can absolutely make the case on both sides. And if you're being honest yourself, you should be able to make the case on both sides. In fact, if you can't make the case on both sides, you have a mental block because you're not thinking deeply enough about an alternative to your point of view, because there are good cases to be made in both directions here. And they should be considered. They should be talked out. The solution here is not ensuring that we only go one direction, that we only go for the ideal. The solution here is better discussion and conversation, and aiming towards better. That's what you want to see in your ethical framework discussions and groups, is aiming towards better. What's the ideal and where are we at and how can we close that gap? So I'll just encourage that to make sure you broaden your understanding. You don't just pick one of these and say, well, this is it. Sorry, I got on my soapbox a little bit there. How can organizations ethically manage consent when future data uses are unpredictable? We don't know how we're going to need this data in the future. How are we going to account for all of that up front? And so this is a conundrum we find ourselves in and is worth kind of mulling through and thinking about. What roles should regulatory bodies play in standardizing consent practices? So if opt-in is the ideal, should regulatory bodies require it? That's a discussion that will be had somewhere, and you might as well start thinking about it yourself and how you would where you'd land. It may just be a useful thought experiment about what's the right choice there. So we went through a lot. I gave a pretty broad overview of a number of issues, but it can be summarized pretty quickly into what this environment is. Security is your requirement by law in order to comply to safe use of data. It's about meeting laws and regulations, but ethical use of data is your responsibility. It goes beyond just compliance. It is complex. It is context specific. It is deeply tied to trust. How do we treat the trust of the patient properly and making sure they feel informed in this environment? So that's the conclusion. Thanks for sticking with me on this topic. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.